Hey everyone, Harold Fisher here again, anchor and host of the Daily Drama on WHUR. Welcome to another edition of HUR at Home on WHUR.com and all of our social media platforms. Tonight we have a very serious issue to discuss with you. We're talking about the shooting of 18-year-old Deon Kay by DC police and the department's approach to gun violence in the city. My guest is Monica Hopkins. She is the executive director of the ACLU of the District of Columbia. Monica, thanks for joining the conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Let's talk briefly for those who may not be familiar with the Deon Kay case, this 18-year-old who was killed by police. From the ACLU's perspective, what do you understand about the case?
So what we know about the case, first and foremost, this is a tragedy. Deon Kay, this is just a tragedy. And so what we know about the case is that police were called, had a call for service of someone having a gun. Came to the location, and when they came to the location, they immediately exited the vehicle, guns drawn, as two individuals ran from the car, one of which being Deon Kay, and the officer ran around in front of Deon Kay and shot him once in the chest. And Deon Kay was killed. And I'm sort of repeating this in sort of like a factual way because we know this from the body cam footage that was released the day after Deon Kay was killed. What we also know is that the gun was found about 98 feet from Deon Kay. It appears as though he was trying to throw the gun away. And it was about 10 seconds from the time the officer exited the vehicle to shooting Deon Kay in the chest.
One of the criticisms that the ACLU has had, and this is having certainly to do with one of the statements that was released by your office, is the criticism about the department's approach to dealing with gun violence in the city, specifically gun recovery. We know that DC Police Chief Peter Newsham and the mayor have spoken time and time again about getting guns off the street. But the ACLU has been critical of the tactics. Can you kind of give me an overview of the perspective of the ACLU as it relates to addressing this issue?
Yeah, so it's important to sort of think about these, and I'm glad you articulated it this way, about the tactics that are used. When we talk about guns in DC, it's not just the police or the mayor that think that this is a problem. It's the communities that have violence in them, know that they have guns in them, who may want the guns out of their communities, or in some cases where we've heard, people may have guns on them for protection for things that are going on in their communities, and they don't trust police. And part of that is because of the tactics that are being used to recover guns in the community and how these communities are being policed. So in order to understand that, you have to understand this gun recovery unit, also known sometimes as NSID, the Narcotics and Special Investigations Division, or colloquially known on the ground as the jump out squads. And the reason that communities called them the jump out squads is because of this tactic of driving up really quickly, and the gun recovery unit usually has unmarked police cars, jumping out of the cars, sort of in a shock and awe militarized, tactic to catch people off guards, and patting people down and searching for guns. This, has led to, in communities, not only the gun recovery unit, but the way that police sometimes interact with citizens in any sort of interaction whatsoever. We have called attention in conjunction with coalition partners on the ground working in these communities about how these tactics are harmful, but additionally about the culture of policing in the District of Columbia. Now, the gun recovery unit is a unit that actually had T-shirts made that said, 2 in the chamber, 1 in the vest, show me your waistband, yo, which is, a tactic they use to roll up. Young Black men usually pull up their T-shirts so they show they don't have guns in their waistbands. On the T-shirt were skull and crossbones. Like, this is a very militarized way in policing communities that, doesn't actually result in trust between the police, the ability to get guns off of the street, to address the fundamental question as why does an 18-year-old have guns in the first place?
I want to back up a little bit about the jump out squad thing, because I remember there was a lot of discussion about the jump out squads even under former police chief Kathleen Lanier, where you had one set of thinking that there needed to be aggressive policing to deal with the uptick in crime in the city. Okay. And you had some people in communities who were saying we need to get these roughnecks out of our community and we need these aggressive tactics. And now, of course, based on, your comments that, we do have these jump out squads, back in action. And at least in this particular case, ended with the killing of Deon Kay. Is there a compromise from your perspective? Because the reality is that even though there may be complications as it relates to eliminating crime and guns from our communities, that the white hat on the white steed. Sometimes, police may have to employ more difficult or aggressive tactics in order to keep crime out of the neighborhood. What do you think is a possible solution for something like that?
It's interesting because I think this goes to the complication of these issues, right? And we constantly sort of keep centering police in the solution to these problems. And, is there a compromise, or is there a way to have more training, or are there certain situations that require this sort of response? I do think that first and foremost, the deeper question is, really getting at the heart of crime and why this is happening, is not a question about police. Like, when we look at, if the police call these high crime areas, if we look at the overlay of poverty, access to resources, educational services, all of the community interventions that have been stripped from these communities. So I live about a mile from where Deon Kay, was killed. We are on a side of a river that, if you live in DC, you wouldn't think that it was DC, because the investments in these communities are not here. We, have food deserts over here. And So it really is, if we want to address this root cause of crime, then we have to start addressing those things. Until we get serious about doing that, then we're just like taking cold medicine for a symptom by adding police and more police and more police and having these violent tactics justified to get guns off of the street. And we will continue having more Deon Kays.
Do you think that the police officers involved in Deon Kay's death should face criminal charges?
We do believe that qualified immunity should be eliminated. This is one of the issues that protects police writ large, whether there can be charges brought or not. We are also a due process organization, so we believe in due process. And if it is found that there is enough evidence to press criminal charges, then criminal charges should be pressed. But in this situation, we have this thing called qualified immunity, that protects officers in their line of duty. It's a really sort of high bar that just keeps saying, oh, unless you can prove that this has happened exactly the way it happened before, then, really it's sort of justified. And that's where we stand, is both by yes, but there's this barrier, and we are a due process organization. So there would have to be the evidence to bring such a case.
We spoke about the video earlier, and again, you may have one school of thought that says, well, the Deon Kays of the district may be carrying weapons for protection because of the environment in which they live. But then you have others that may be looking at it from the perspective of the police officer who says he had a gun. Mm-hmm. And the video shows that at one point, at least at one point, he had it in his hand. But we also know from various and sundry reporting that it was found, as you said, some 90 some odd feet away. From the perspective of this case, the fact that he had a gun to begin with, does that make this much more complicated?
I think the whole thing is complicated. Mm-hmm. Deon Kay was 18 years old, but he turned 18 3 weeks prior to his death, and the reasons for having a gun as a young Black man in the District of Columbia are highly complicated. And what I see, just, to be squarely honest as a human being, what I see when I see the photos of Deon Kay being circulated is I see, a young man a young teenager doing something that, is just stupid. And, to the extent that, it is very complicated. And there were people in Deon Kay's life trying to unpack those things. Yeah. He had a mentor. He had, he was working with his mom. His mom was trying to get them out of the community. And so, I think that these issues, the instantaneousness of the decision that there is a gun, we shoot the person with the gun. And the mayor did say, what I see is someone had a gun, mm-hmm. and the police were getting a gun off the street. And what I see is this was a young man that was shot, and who knows what children were looking out their window when this happened and saw that interaction with police, and it has long-term effects, not only, on their trauma, the community's trauma, how this affects them, but also how it affects their relationships with police, how it affects police's ability to have community trust, that when they see guns or know of things, that they will actually go to the police and say, let's get these off the street, because I think that is a value. The community also doesn't want violence.
Right.
You know, they want to be able to thrive. And that's why this is so incredibly complicated.
A final question for you, because one of the things that the ACLU has been very clear about is that the organization has found the Metropolitan Police Department to be problematic, and I'm being diplomatic, in saying that this is bigger than Deon Kay. You didn't just decide with the death of Deon Kay that all of a sudden there's a problem with DC police. Why do you believe that that is the case? Lay out the case for DC police being a problematic agency.
So, you know, I could do a short sort of timeline here. We, you know, have advocated for a long time that DC police's tactics are problematic. And so, you know, you can go back to the Pershing Park incident in the early 2000s, where protesters were kettled, which is this act of circling the protesters and held for a really long time. They used zip ties and were sort of like hogtied, and the city ended up paying millions in restitution. And those tactics were tactics employed under a different chief, but the acting officer was the now Chief Newsham. We see those tactics that were employed during inauguration. They're being employed right now. Then we passed the NEAR Act about 4 years ago, the Neighborhood Engagement Achieves Results Act. And a piece of that legislation, it was wholesale sort of a public health approach to public safety. And one of the pieces was about data collection, because we wanted to understand, you know, how, and we thought it was just good police practice to look at, you know, how police are policing, who they're stopping, who they're frisking, who, like, to understand, are there disparities going on? Because we were hearing on the ground there are disparities. And they did not, even though it was the law, you had a law enforcement agency not complying with the law for 3 years until we sued them. And just recently, we got the first 6 months of data that show massive racial disparities. There were 63, you know, thousand stops across the city. And, you know, in the gun recovery, because that's why they say that there are these stops, it was a little over 1% in those stops. And the surprising statistic for us that really stood out was, you know, the number of youth 18 and under that were stopped and frisked was about 87% of those stops resulted in that. And so, you know, this combined with multiple pieces of litigation that we have had against the Metropolitan Police Department, like our client, Mr. Cottingham, who was simply outside of his house with an open container, figuring out where to go for his birthday with his friends, and they have 7 police cars roll up. He, you know, has a frisk on the sidewalk, ends up being a body cavity search on the sidewalk. And, you know, incredibly invasive, incredibly, you know, humiliating by this officer. This is how officers interact with the Black community. And yet, if you go on Capitol Hill, which is a largely majority white part of the city, or less Black than just across the river, then, you know, you can see people sitting in Lincoln Park or outside of their house on the sidewalks with an open container during the summer talking to their neighbors, which is exactly what Mr. Cottingham was doing. So these kind of patterns and practices and ways we treat communities have been problematic in the Metropolitan Police Department for some time.
Do you think that this is a Chief Peter Newsham issue in the district, or is this a bigger issue, because as you suggested, these things have been going on since before he was chief. Some would argue before the previous chief was there. So is this starting with addressing the issue with Police Chief Newsham's leadership and then doing something else, or is it just more holistic?
I think this is a situation of both and.
Mm.
So, you know, as someone who is the leader of my organization, I set the tone.
Right.
I set what will be acceptable and what will not be acceptable in sort of my team that I lead. And so I think that there is something to be said for the leadership of this organization. I also do think that there are some intricacies in how police departments are run, and that it is a culture and history issue. You know, the way policing in this country was set up was, you know, as slave catchers. It's a history that is well documented, and we have to, you know, admit it to ourselves in order to make sure that we acknowledge and move past it. We also have to acknowledge that, you know, there is an interest that police have to protect property, right? And so those things, combined with the fact that it is really difficult, it is incredibly difficult because of the culture of policing for police officers themselves to stand up when they see something wrong.
Mm.
So, you know, if you have to stay behind the blue line, even if you know something is wrong, then this whole argument about bad apples does not make sense, and it does not compute, because the whole adage is one bad apple spoils the entire bunch.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can't take that bad apple out, either because of issues around the union contract and all of those things, or issues because officers fear retaliation, they fear, you know, what happens to them and their livelihood and their identity if they step forward, then you never will have culture change in the organization. And so I think those things sort of round out. It's not just about getting rid of the leader or keeping the leader. They define the culture, and then they have to be committed to what about the culture they want to change in order to have effective policing that is constitutional and responsive to community needs.
Monica Hopkins, the Executive Director of the ACLU in the District of Columbia, thank you so much for sharing your insight and your thoughts with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Harold.
Okay. And I'm Harold Fisher on this another edition of HUR at Home. As always, I'll see you next week, and I'll see you on the radio.